COVID-19 has been a wild ride for America, and it seems that we may have still a ways to go. Looking backward, have we made the right decisions about lockdowns, vaccines, masks, and social distancing? Looking forward, where are we headed next with new COVID variants, new public health measures? And what has this highly contentious public health crisis done to the American character? Today, we'll discuss all this and more with our special guest, Dr. Scott Atlas, who was a pivotal member of the White House COVID task force during the Trump administration. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us for an independent conversation coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. I'm Graham Walker, and we are broadcasting from our studios right across the bay from San Francisco. Also welcoming our many, many friends who are joining us today via thinkspot.com, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And before we begin, let me also welcome my colleague, Dr. Williamson M. Bill Evers directs our Center on Educational Excellence, and before he joined the Independent Institute, he was for many years a colleague of Scott Atlas at the Hoover Institution. And now to Dr. Atlas, who presently serves as the Robert Wesson Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution, which is, of course, located right in the center of the campus of Stanford University. Dr. Atlas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're really grateful to have you. And we are looking forward to our conversation today. It seems that President Trump appointed you to his COVID task force in August of 2020. Have I got that date right?
Yes, you do. I was asked to come out there at the end of July, and I ended up, first task force meeting I was in was sort of mid-August.
Yes, well, that was pretty a wild ride for you as well as for the country. And we're curious to know, I know that you're the Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution. I know you've got your MD from the University of Chicago. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you were equipped to help at that point when you were appointed to the COVID task force? What sets you up to be able to do that?
Sure. Well, I mean, my background is about 17 years in healthcare policy at Hoover. Part of that time, I was still working as a professor in the School of Medicine at Stanford, where I was the chief of neuroradiology. So I had a maybe 25-year background in medical science and a 15 plus years in healthcare policy. And of course, it's good to have both, because especially when there's a crisis in healthcare, as we have and have had now for quite a while in the United States and in the world. And so, just as an aside, my background in medical science is actually interestingly relevant because it involves diagnostic sort of compilation of dealing with referrals from various medical subspecialties, all of them, whether it's cardiology or infectious disease or pediatrics or ophthalmology, neurology, neurosurgery, of course, and integrating information and coming in with some deductive reasoning and figuring out what's going on. But specifically, I was asked because I was in healthcare policy.
What was needed was not only someone with a very narrow specialty knowledge of immunology, but someone like you able to think about the public health, public policy implementation and aspects of it. You kind of rounded out the team, I'm thinking.
And familiarity with broad ranges of research and data analysis, too, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the issue that people don't really understand, and it was sort of shocking, was that there was no one on the task force who had a record of being a health policy scholar. And you would think that would be pretty important when you're talking about health policy. So it's sort of ironic that and interesting that things were very much distorted in the focus on, he's not an epidemiologist. Because in reality, epidemiologists or a virologist, I mean, there were no epidemiologists on the task force, by the way, frankly. But people with an immunology background or a virology background, that's good, but that's not who you want to design healthcare policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I'm thinking there was something about a kind of a complete team once you got on board, which was reassuring, at least from a distance. But it was a wild ride, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later from you. But before we go there, can you kind of like jump to the present with us? A lot of people are talking about the Delta variant. I hear people saying, "Oh, it's even worse than the original variant, and cases are going up with Delta." What's your take on the Delta variant? Can you explain a little bit about what it is and where it's
Sure.
going?
Given that it's very hazardous to make predictions, I will give you what seems to be true. This is it sort of highlights several problems, including one that you've already mentioned, which is this focus on cases as the endpoint here.
Cases rather than deaths or hospitalizations or other serious things.
Well, cases alone are not the issue. It's the serious consequences
Right.
of those cases that are the issue. And Delta variant is a mutant, a variant of this virus. This is how all viruses really work as they evolve toward becoming a sort of what's called endemic, which is a background of ups and downs with a lot less lethality. So Delta variant is a variant that seems to be more contagious, but seems to be less lethal than the original virus. And why do I say it's less lethal? Because although we are seeing explosions of cases, at least in the places in the world that have these explosions of cases, we are not seeing the same equivalent explosion in deaths. And there are two reasons for that. One, of course, is we're better at protecting older people who are likely to die because we partly, to a great extent, because of the vaccinations of the older people. That's the purpose of the vaccine, to stop people from dying. And then the second reason might be that the virus variant itself is less lethal. So we're still in the process of dealing with this Delta variant, but some countries have, first of all, the Delta variant is the dominant variant all over the world. From what I have looked at, there's only one country in the world that is not dominated by the Delta variant in what I can see of all the major countries, and that's Brazil. So suffice it to say that everywhere else, Delta variant is nearly 100% of the cases. But it looks like places that have had the Delta variant have not had the explosion of deaths, and some have already come down. For instance, India was in the news as being explosive. Of course, their cases per capita were nowhere near what ours are, or other countries. Their deaths per capita were nowhere near what the other countries are. But that, again, like a complete lack of understanding or perspective on the data. It's not just absolute numbers. If you're in a tiny little island and there's only one person there, you're not going to get a lot of cases. So if you place like India where there's a lot of people, you're going to get a lot of cases, but per capita, it wasn't as bad. But right now what's happening in the United States, if I may go on, is what we saw last summer, which is that there are cases coming in. And in fact, it's a very similar pattern to about a year ago, where we had Florida and the South, the so-called South, which is Texas, Florida, and some of the other states in the South, get a lot of cases, and then those cases will come down, and we will get more cases in the rest of the country. And that's what happened last summer and fall. And if you may remember, in October, roughly September, October, after the cases in the South had come down with their natural cycle that happens all over the world, the cases started exploding in the Midwest, upper Midwest, Rocky Mountain area, and then those cases came down. So this is a virus that is seasonal, apparently.
Does it like hot weather or cold weather better?
Well, I'm not sure it's so perfectly discernible, but we know that the South and Brazil during their winter, which was our summer, their cases are dramatically lower now in Brazil. They're coming down. So, it's hard to say because, of course, Florida and the South, I don't know. I don't think Florida's ever cold. And so it's hard to categorize it so rigidly, but we can say it's seasonal because it's periodic. It comes in waves and then it goes away. and it's going away because of these seasonal impacts that are not quite fully understood, of course, as well as the regional immunity. And nowadays we have some immunity, of course, from the vaccinations, but we also have a lot of immunity from previous recovered people who were infected, which of course we don't hear anything about, but it's very real and highly likely to be better than the vaccine immunity.
I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, because in the calls of people to get everybody vaccinated, they do seem to ignore the numbers of people who have immunity from having had the disease or for other reasons.
That's exactly, one of the issues that is puzzling, to say the least, which is that natural immunity. It's as if we knew nothing about immunology, nothing about infectious disease. We start from scratch. We've never heard of natural immunity, and therefore everyone must be vaccinated. Well, that's just simply false. That's pseudoscience. That's denying science. That's misinformation, whatever the words you want to use. And it's very sad, as one of many examples where there is a refusal to acknowledge fundamental, medical science. And we know even in this virus, there's a body of literature that shows that not only from previous infections, but from this infection, the immunity is broader after having recovered, because you don't have to be a scientist to understand this, but you basically are getting a protection against all the different parts of the virus, to put it in a simplistic way, rather than the targeted part that the vaccine was developed against. And secondly, it appears, like in other viruses, specifically like in other coronaviruses, and even more specifically, like in SARS-1, where we have, in SARS-1's case, 17 years of infection immunity protection. Against SARS-2 now, still basically, the SARS-1 blood samples show immune reaction, a robust one, to SARS-2 17 years later. And there's a lot of indication in the literature that the SARS-2 natural immunity will be long-lasting, longer lasting than the vaccine immunity, and is not something that should be discarded. In fact, it's a very fundamental part of protecting individuals as well as society.
I have a question on that spot, though, just to be clear. Dr. Atlas, or if I may call you Scott, did you actually say 17 years?
Well, this is SARS-1.
Yeah, I know.
A study from Singapore where they showed 17 years later very robust T-cell immunity protection, a form of immunity, a form of protection, 17 years later against SARS-2.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a long part of this that I'm not going to go into, but there's a memory-based, durable part of your immune system that resides in your lymph nodes or in your bone marrow. And basically, without sounding too esoteric here, we expect and hope that long-lasting immunity will be available to people who have had the infection.
Wow.
So you mentioned, when we were talking about the vaccine, that one of the things that's improved casualty rates, fatality rates, is that we targeted old people. I wonder if you could go back to the fact that who was vulnerable, particularly to serious cases of this, what should have been done, perhaps drawing on the example of Florida versus other states. And then let's kind of get into the lockdowns and the school closures and vaccine passports and some other things, because I think we need to start getting into the public policy aspects of this also, in addition to the disease aspects.
Yes, Bill. So, the fundamental sort of argument that I made back in March, beginning in March of 2020, which seems like an eternity ago, and others were making the argument, and then more and more people made the argument that we should use a strategy basically called targeted protection or focused protection. Because basically what was recommended by the task force was recommended by many of the faces of public health and was implemented in almost the entire country was not targeted protection. It was a lockdown.
This is the task force before you were on it.
Yeah, and the lockdown. And so the lockdown meant trying to protect everybody by stopping or limiting all human interaction and doing a variety of maneuvers, closing businesses, closing schools, quarantining, curfewing, confining people, limiting even group contact with your own family, etc. That's lockdown. That's what was done. And what I advocated instead was something called targeted protection, which meant increase the protection of those that are vulnerable and let the low-risk people live their lives. Now, why did that make sense, targeted protection, which is your first question, Bill?
Right.
And that's the biggest part of what we were given as a gift by nature here, if I may phrase it that way, was that the virus was only dangerous, only highly dangerous to people who were older or who had certain comorbidities, certain underlying conditions. And it was the opposite for children and younger, healthier people. It was not very dangerous. And there are numbers to back that up. And this was known back in March when I said it of 2020. And there's nothing that has changed the fact that this virus affected, the average age, the median age of death in most countries was equal to the age of life expectancy. Okay, roughly 80 years old. 80% of deaths were in people over 65. Something like 3/4 of people who died had obesity as an underlying condition, and almost everybody had a significant underlying condition, as opposed to children who had very, very extremely low risk of any serious illness and nearly zero risk of dying from this virus. In fact, the risk from this virus is less than seasonal influenza. And there's some other numbers I just want to go through here. People who are under 40, the infection fatality rate is less than or equal to seasonal influenza for people under 40, which is about 0.01%. For people who are under 70, the infection fatality rate is 0.05%. That's still, for people over 50, it's higher than flu, but it's not an order of magnitude higher than flu. And then, the people that really have a very high risk are people who are old and sickly, frail. There are many ways to describe them. And so the bottom line is the virus is not very dangerous for the vast majority of people. That's just factually true. And it's not arguable because that's the data. And the second part of it is the sort of the beauty of being something unique compared to influenza, which is it does not significantly impact children. Statistically, that does not mean 0 children die from COVID. That's not true. But what it does mean is that there's an extremely low risk for children, less than or equal to influenza. And the point of that is to give some medical perspective on things, because we don't lock down schools for seasonal influenza.
We didn't even lock it down for polio in my youth.
Yeah. And, to say it in a different way, in California, which I know relatively well because I live here, California, 5.4% of California deaths from seasonal influenza a couple years ago were in children. Do you know what percent of deaths in California are from COVID-19? 0%. It doesn't mean zero numerically, but 0%. It's that small. It's that infrequent. So there's some perspective here that was missing. So the rationale for targeted protection is we know who's vulnerable. We know who's not vulnerable. Let's do everything we can to protect the vulnerable and not lock down everyone else. And why don't we lock down everyone else? Not just because it's unnecessary. That's not it. It's because it's so harmful, so destructive. And I can go through, when you ask me, the statistics on that.
Well, could you go through that, including possible health problems with being inside all the time, psychological problems, economic problems. I just bring
Sure.
out some of
So,
this
so,
stuff.
so
Yeah.
the way that I'll take a step back and say this. The way that people were convinced and remain convinced that lockdowns were important is because the first argument made was that people who are advocating against lockdowns were choosing money over lives. Okay, that's a false dichotomy.
Right.
That's a lie, frankly,
Yeah.
because as every economist knows, and most educated people, severe economic hardship costs lives. It
Right.
costs life years. People die. The second part is that they convince people that the people who are advocating ending the lockdown were dangerous. Okay, but here's the reality. The reality is the lockdowns killed people. Now, why do I say that? A, they convinced people to not go in to seek medical care, and hospitals and medical care was actually shut down intentionally for many, many very serious critical diseases. And some of the statistics are okay, of the 650,000 Americans who have cancer, half of them skipped their chemotherapy during the spring of 2020.
I know people who deferred their cancer treatments for a year.
Absolutely. About half of heart attack and stroke patients didn't call the ambulance because they were afraid to go into a medical facility. About 2/3 to 3/4 of cancer screenings were not done. 85% of living organ transplants were not done. That doesn't mean they didn't need the transplant. These diseases didn't go away. And when you close down things like that, it's not just that people die because of absent diagnosis or failed, absence of treatment. We also shut down the schools and closed in families. And what did that do? It really severely and heinously impacted our younger generation and children in the following way. In the spring alone, 300,000 cases of child abuse went unreported because schools are where child abuse is the primary agency for noticing child abuse. It's not just that online learning is a failure documented. It's not just that people miss their nutritional needs, is that kids that needed a vision or hearing correction were not noticed. It's that severe pediatric emergency room child abuse cases where children brought in because the parents thought they killed them went up 35%. It's because of the massive psychological harm. If you looked at the CDC data, people in college, 1 out of 4 American college age kids thought of killing themselves in June. There was a tripling of medical visits in teenagers for self-harm over last year, which means kids cutting their wrists, slashing their wrists, putting out cigarettes on their skin. And I'm being very graphic intentionally because this is the reality. It's not about being inconvenient or having your kids underfoot. I just looked at the data. There's a double to triple increase in the young people with anxiety disorder or depressive symptoms. We have 52% of college age kids in America had an unwanted weight gain during 2020, and that average weight gain was 28 pounds. Okay, so we are creating a massive psychiatric and public health catastrophe with the lockdowns. So the lockdowns were severely harmful, and it was the wrong strategy. And if I can add something that's very important, if you're not going to ask me this, the lockdowns failed.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the unwritten, unspoken, somehow unspoken fact is that by the analyses, and I'll give you a couple of studies, the lockdowns, number one, failed to protect the vulnerable. Okay, because the old people died, the old people were still 40 to 50% of the deaths. The lockdowns were unable to protect the very people that were already in a regulated environment, nursing homes. It was necessary to go through hoops to get into a nursing home. The lockdown strategy, the broad lockdown strategy, did not stop the old people from dying. That's a disgrace. And that is one of the most unspoken tragedies, but so obvious. It didn't work even to do that. It still destroyed all these people. And the lockdowns did not stop the cases from spreading, because there's this bizarre lack of recognition that locking down does not eradicate the virus, number one. And number two, the data shows, and we can look at the study from Stanford published, I think, in January of 2021, that did a meticulous examination of lockdowns all over the world. And the lockdowns failed, the strict lockdowns failed to stop the spread of the infection. And in the words of John Ioannidis, one of the authors, the first author is Ben David, John Ioannidis said the lockdowns were pro-contagion. The second study I would like to point your listeners to is a study from June of 2021, so it's recent, from Agrawal of USC, National Bureau of Economic Research. He looked at the lockdowns in all the states and in, I think it was 40 countries. I'm sorry, I can't remember the number now. And he showed that the lockdowns did not stop the deaths, but worse than that, the lockdowns increased the deaths. And when those regions had dying deaths per capita coming down, once the lockdowns were instituted, the deaths started increasing. So it is incredible. I am still incredulous at the denial of the data, the denial of the failure, and the insistence that we must again do these restrictions when they were grossly failing to do what they were billed as doing.
Do you think that this is a combination of some things like this? Politicians wanting to do something dramatic, being told by the people they talk to in their circles and by journalists, you have to do something. The kind of targeted thing that you have talked about, Scott, is too minimal, not big enough. That these decision makers get a sense that they're getting control of things, that they have a handle on things, that if it were a more minimal targeted thing, they might not have as big a sense of control. I'm trying to reach for why they wouldn't look at the data. I know they were getting other interpretations than yours, but I'm trying to also think if there were other reasons in the dynamics of politics that might have been going on.
Well, I'm often asked the question, why? And I think, as all of us know, that any question that starts with why is very difficult to answer.
Yes.
But it's shocking in many ways. This is my take on it. I do not know the answer to why. I can tell you this, that there is such gross incompetence in the people in charge. And I know that sounds like that's a simplistic explanation, but it's very true. I saw it with my own eyes. And you can read about it in my book. You will be stunned. The book is stunning because it's the truth. I can tell you that, there is a gross denial of reality. I listen still to the people. The architect of the lockdowns in the United States were Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci. They wanted the lockdowns. The lockdowns were implemented throughout the entire country with a couple of rare exceptions. And then they say the policies failed, hundreds of thousands of people's lives were lost unnecessarily. Well, that was their policy. So we're living in this, I don't know if it's it's sort of a combination of Kafka and Alice in Wonderland, and at times it was Catch-22 in the White House. But these people are denying reality. There is a tremendous amount of gross incompetence. And this is exactly why outside people need to be consulted that don't have a career internally as a bureaucrat for 40 years, whose whole purpose and job depends on their navigating the political world inside. The data was not understood. The data was not looked at in any sophisticated level whatsoever. I was the only one bringing in the research into the meetings. Okay, I was in a room full of people. I would bring in a stack of scientific papers, 15 papers, 20 papers. I would go through the literature. There wasn't a single time where anyone else brought in a scientific paper. These people were not acting like scientists. They were not acting like critical thinkers. They were not acting with a medical perspective. I could tell you a lot about what they were not doing. And in the end, the wrong policies were
Your book
implemented.
has chapter and verse on examples of this.
Yes, it does. And it's not, the importance of saying these things are many, if I can add this, which is we need to know what happened. Okay, the American people need to know the truth because we cannot ever let this happen again. And we will have another pandemic. There is no every single person in infectious disease realizes we will have another pandemic. We better know how to deal with these things in a fashion that is better than what we did. And I'm very skeptical about that because there is such tremendous incompetence. There is tremendous reluctance and complete really denial of contrary evidence and data and thinking. There is a lack of interest in admitting error. There is a massive ego buy-in by these people, a face saving. These people are on TV almost every day. They're never going to admit they were wrong. That is my prediction. Never, literally never.
Yeah.
And, the problem here is how do people, regular people in the public, judge who to believe? And I was asked this at one of the press conferences when I was on the podium because I was contrary to what was said by someone else. And I think it's a very difficult problem, who to believe. But the one thing that we must have to arrive at any truth is the freedom of information. People need to be able to express the science, their interpretation of the science, the views, the policy views. And the only way that we will ever have the ability to arrive at the right solution and to afford the public of their role, which is to make the decisions, they need to have the information. And so the way this has been conducted, and it's still going on today, there's a massive amount of censorship on the social media. There is a massive bias in the conventional media. The universities are busy censuring people and completely really not fulfilling their role as being the center for free exchange of ideas. And it's been extraordinarily harmful.
So I'm wondering if we could go back to the evidence matter and segue into masks, talk about masks in general, the physical aspect of the particles of disease, the filtration, talk about masks for children, maybe segue into vaccines for children, and then let's not lose sight of this issue of censure, because you had your own experience at Stanford that we should hear about. So maybe we could go ahead, Graham.
I guess you want to avoid all the hot button issues.
Clearly, right? Clearly.
No.
But let me just. I mean, I'm having a hard time digesting all the information that you're providing. So let me just go back to one little point that I heard you say to make sure I'm understanding it right, and maybe others are sort of with me, slightly slow processors here. People argued back during that period that you're narrating to us that because certain populations were especially vulnerable, those with, the elderly and other pre-existing conditions and the obese and so forth, because that subset was very vulnerable, we needed to have universal lockdown, not because we didn't care about those people, but because we did, and everyone had to sacrifice a universal lockdown, suffer a universal lockdown, so to protect those special subcategories. And when you argued that the better way was to protect those subcategories more intensely, it seemed that some people took that to mean that therefore we shouldn't care about them as much because we weren't willing to suffer a universal lockdown. And I think you're telling me that the lockdown didn't help those subcategories. Is that right?
Well, the lockdowns didn't work. That's factually true. And but I think it's just sort of odd. I don't care about, the virus doesn't care about feelings. The virus doesn't care about intent.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, neither do I, to some extent. But that's not the issue. The issue is here, there were ways, and I recommended them, and some of them were eventually done, to increase the protection of the high risk. It was absolutely not true that everything was being done to protect the high risk people. I'll give you a couple of examples. And this is also in the book in more detail, but just off the top of my head, nursing home cases are known to be high-risk tinderboxes for infectious diseases. This has always been true. Every first-year medical student knows that the upper respiratory infections spread like crazy in older people who have conditions, underlying conditions. But more so than that, there are documented bodies of evidence of every virus running rampant and killing people in nursing homes, including common cold viruses, have an extraordinarily high mortality rate in nursing homes. That's how frail the people are. So that's a given that was known. And it's also known that the cases, and again, you don't have to be a genius to figure this out. Where do the cases come in? Well, they don't come in through the people living inside the nursing home. They come in through the staff. And it turns out that a lot of the nursing home staff work in more than one nursing home. So you can imagine that someone who's infected with SARS-2 is really infecting many different nursing homes, and these people are dying. And we all know the debacle in the various states where the governors didn't prevent infected nursing home residents from coming out of the hospital back into nursing homes. I'm not going to go into that, but the point is that what was being done? Well, there was a supposed policy of, well, let's make sure that the nursing home staff are tested once per week. Now, when I heard that, I was shocked, because that is absolutely nowhere near enough. Okay, that's just not even close to being an extraordinary amount of diligence on protecting the people in nursing homes. And so I said, we should be testing in the nursing homes 3 days a week, 5 days a week, every single day, when the communities have high case rates, because the people working in the nursing homes are living in the communities, not to mention the visitors, but that's a separate thing. It's the staff that brings in the cases, and I advocated for upping the frequency of testing to every single day if necessary, to alerting the nursing homes when there's high spread in the community, to start testing and alerting the senior centers, non-residential places where seniors frequent, to get testing in the nursing homes that is on the spot, instant, rapid testing, to get CDC strike teams in there when there is a nursing home outbreak, to get extra positive personal protective equipment into the nursing homes. Governor DeSantis in Florida set up separate COVID-only nursing homes for the people who are nursing home residents who were positive for COVID. He took them out. He took them out of the hospital. He didn't let them back in the nursing home. He forbade that. Instead, he set up COVID-only nursing. He tried to isolate them. There are many things that could have been done, that should have been done, that weren't done. And eventually things were done. Again, like, I didn't get to Washington until August. But I could tell you from the data that the survival rates in the nursing home, this is pre-vaccine, was 50% better from April until compared with November. 50% better, and partly because of all these maneuvers. We also set up infection teams, alliances with hospitals, to teach nursing homes how to do better infection control. They're not used to working like that in a regular nursing home. We've all been in nursing homes, probably visiting family members, and it's a certain level, but it's not really a hospital level for infection control. There were things that could have been done. There were things that should have been done. There were things I recommended that increased the protection of the high-risk people. It was not true that there was everything that was being done. Instead, what was done was it wasn't just a waste of resources. It was massively destructive, and it continues today. And again, there's what I told you statistically is just the tip of the iceberg for the damage that was done. Yet that is never, even today, a topic of discussion in the news.
So you've been advocating for less universal lockdowns, but more protection for the vulnerable.
That's right.
In a word, and in other words, it didn't mean you didn't care about the vulnerable simply because you thought universal lockdowns wouldn't help. You actually wanted more care for the vulnerable.
It didn't mean I didn't care about the vulnerable. It meant that I wanted to stop them from dying. I wasn't satisfied with watching them die. Let's put it that way.
So one theory of protection is mask wearing. So I think we should get into the particle size of the virus, the filtration, what kind of evidence there is on effectiveness of masks, the people who want children to wear masks, and then segue into the vaccines in children. And
Sure.
there's even more issues that come from that. Go ahead.
Sure. So, but to finish up on the older people before I go into the mass, I just want to say something that the ultimate targeted protection strategy is to make sure that the elderly get vaccinated first. And there is only one governor that said no to the CDC guideline, which was first responders need to be vaccinated first and elderly are second. And that was
how about first responders and then teachers? Because the teachers union is so powerful, teachers have to be vaccinated.
Yeah. So Governor DeSantis specifically did the right thing, and I'm not sitting here advocating for Governor DeSantis. I'm just saying sometimes, common sense, 1 + 1 = 2. You got the group of people that might die, you better vaccinate them. And so that's what was done, and that's really what was done by most governors eventually. And that's the right strategy. That is a form of targeted or focused protection. Now, to go into masks, masks, are the third rail of the COVID pandemic for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start off by saying I really wish masks worked. It would be great if we had something very simple that actually worked. And so the data on the masks is a slam dunk, obvious, and it will never be admitted by people who are really on the side of mask mandates and things. But here's some of the data. I could briefly go through it. We knew before the COVID pandemic that masks did not stop virus infection spreading.
We knew about flu, right?
Yeah, let me just go through the categories of what I'm going to go through. We knew that masks did not work for stopping the spread of upper respiratory viral infections. We knew that, the CDC knew it, everyone knew it. Then we saw all the empirical evidence, meaning the real world data from the places that wore masks, including the United States, which I will go through, that did not stop the spread. And then later on in the pandemic, we had even more definitive studies done that prove that general population mask usage does not stop the spread of the infection. Now I'll go through that. In terms of what we knew, okay, back in May of 2020, the CDC published a review of all the literature on including randomized trials on masks to stop influenza. Masks did not stop the spread of influenza from the people wearing the mask, nor did it protect the people wearing the mask from getting influenza. That's essentially a paraphrase of an exact quote, only because I don't have it in front of me. That was May 2020 from all the studies. That was also reviewed by Oxford University's Jefferson and Hennigan, who ran the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at University of Oxford, who said the same thing, that there is no significant evidence that masks work stopping the spread of virus. Now, why is that relevant? What does it matter what it did with flu? It matters because flu is essentially the same size virus as this virus. And as Dr. Fauci's email revealed by the FOIA request revealed, that he wrote back in the spring, early spring of 2020, masks do not stop, general population masks do not stop the spread of this virus because this virus is spread mainly by aerosol, which means when you breathe, the virus comes out, and if you ever wore a mask with sunglasses on or whatever, it fogs up. That's what happens when you wear a mask. But secondly, the virus is so small it goes through the pore size of a surgical mask. It's obvious that it also goes through a scarf or any kind of homemade cloth mask, whatever. But a surgical mask does not stop this virus, period. The empirical evidence that then followed was that all over the country, all over the United States, there were 38 states that do mask mandates. And when you see the curves, mask mandate on, cases exploded. Mask mandate, cases exploded. Mask mandate, cases exploded. Whether it was Hawaii or LA County or Miami-Dade County or Alabama, and on, every state. And so then you say, well, maybe that was the mask mandate. People weren't wearing masks. Americans weren't wearing masks. Well, that's not true either, because studies from YouGov, Gallup poll, Pew, COVID Consortium, CDC all documented 80 to 90% mask usage, and the cases exploded. There was also no difference in the cases per capita over time. The whole curve is identical in the states that didn't have masks and the states that did. And then you say, well, but didn't they work outside the US? No, they didn't. And you look at the curves, and they're in my book, by the way, from whether it's Austria or the United Kingdom or Israel or all over Europe. And they say, well, maybe it worked in Asia because more people in Asia wear it. Well, you look at the curves in South Korea and Japan, where 96 to 99% mask compliance, and the cases exploded through the mask usage. It is factually untrue, proven, that masks stop the spread of infection. Now, the third part of the evidence, I went through what we knew. I then said what we saw, and now what we learned, which is later in the pandemic. The two key studies are the Denmark study of over 6,000 adult participants using high-quality surgical masks, comparing general population mask usage to not mask usage, randomized controlled study, did not stop, no difference in the incidence of getting COVID in the two groups, none. No incidence of getting COVID in the two groups, even if you just say the people that wore it absolutely according to instruction all the time, no difference in cases. And then the more interesting part really is that they also tested for 11 other viruses, and not a single virus had a difference between wearing the mask and not wearing the mask. That is the definitive study on mask usage. Now, there's a final study that I want to point out. I hate to spend so much time on masks because it's a peripheral issue.
It's very important because
yes.
The
well, it's important to kids because
interested. That's right.
And so the final study that was done was published by University of Louisville, and they did a study analyzing all 50 states and I think 23 countries with masks. I forget the exact number. And they showed mask mandates did not stop the spread of infection. Mask usage did not stop the spread of infection. And, this is done. This is an issue that is proven. Yet not only will people not admit masks don't work, but they will not acknowledge these studies were done. And so what do we hear that is contrary? People say, well, but why do people say masks work? There's three reasons, in my view. The first reason is they say doctors wear masks, don't they? And okay, I've done hundreds of medical procedures wearing a mask. Doctors wear masks to stop bodily fluids from hitting them in the face or from spitting into a sterile incision. Okay, so I don't want my spit to go into an incision that I made. I don't want to sneeze or cough into an incision. That's not stopping viral infections. There is zero evidence, that masks stop viral infection in doctors. That is not why doctors wear masks. The second point of view, you say, why do masks work? Because there's a bunch of particle studies with robots that have been published, and they keep being published. And the fact is that I don't care what a mask does to a particle study. We know that masks don't stop the spread of infection. That's the only thing that matters. We are not wearing a mask to stop a particle. We are wearing a mask to stop the spread of an infection. So, the earth is round, and I don't have to I really feel like it's exhausting to keep trying to prove that the earth is round to people who are today's flat earthers. General population masks don't work, period. Now, that's not to say that there's no role for masks in anybody. I think this is important. I've always recommended wear a mask when you cannot socially distance if you are particularly immunocompromised or have a problem. And why do you wear a mask if you cannot socially distance or in certain settings like when you're symptomatic? Because we're trying to stop people from coughing in your face. That's the reason. It has nothing to do with walking around or breathing or going past somebody in a restaurant as you walk to your table. Some of the stuff is ludicrous. But if you want to stop somebody from coughing in your face, okay, that's reasonable. If you're symptomatic and someone's taking care of you, you should put a mask on. Why? Because we don't want you to cough in their face. That's what symptomatic means. But from simple breathing, masks do not stop breathing. That should be obvious to people, but it was already proven. Now, the issue of children in schools en masse is another level of absurdity, but it's not just absurd, it's very harmful. And I'll tell you why. Because, first of all, children have extraordinarily low risk from the illness. Children don't need masks. Why would they, even if a mask worked, why would they wear a mask in school if they have no reason they don't have a significant risk from the illness? And it's proven, by the way, proven, it's not a question, that children only rarely spread to adults. That's proven also. And the third thing that's proven is that the schools that were open without masks had no problem with infection. We know that from Sweden, when there were, I forget the number, I think it's 1.8 million children were in Sweden without masks, without social distancing. There was no increase in infection. The teachers did not get increased infections. There was no increase in infections between teachers and other careers. This has been proven all over Europe. The second part of it is we have the data in Florida. Florida has a group of schools that had masks and a group of schools that did not have masks. And I just saw the data. I looked at it myself 2 days ago. There was no statistical difference between the number of cases in schools without masks and with masks. So even if children did have a vulnerability, even if children did spread the disease, masks don't work to stop that. But so the biggest reason is, well, then why don't you do it? Because, hey, it's not a big ask to wear a mask. This is what we hear. Because masks are harmful. Why are they harmful? Well, they're particularly harmful to children. There are dozens of papers now documenting the masks are filthy. You're breathing in bacteria. You're breathing in chemicals from the mask. They cause a problem with learning in schools for children. Particularly, children don't learn. They get hot. They can't sit still. They can't learn language with a mask on. There's a problem with communication with a mask on. But it's also a psychological problem. The WHO doesn't recommend specifically, do not wear a mask if you're exercising. Yet in the United States, we commonly see kids playing lacrosse or running outside or jogging in school with a mask on. This is contrary to public health recommendation. Any parent who thinks that their kid's going to be okay wearing a mask 8 hours a day, I don't want to go so far as to say something bad about the parents, but I'm a little bit concerned about their ability to think straight there. So I'm very concerned. The data is in on masks. The data is also in that masks are harmful, particularly to children. And I just think that is really, it's abusive to have kids wear masks.
I think we should say a little bit about vaccines in children, a little bit about therapeutic treatment, a little bit about how the Stanford faculty treated you. And I think if you finished up about your book, that would be the ideal rest of our time. Go ahead, a modification.
For the book, let me just make a quick cameo mention that the book is titled "A Plague Upon Our House, My Fight at the Trump White House to Stop COVID from Destroying America." I'm finding it listed here for pre-order on Amazon, and it's coming out in November. Is that right, Scott?
That's right. And for now, it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, okay.
We'll see what happens.
Check it out. Okay, so now, Bill, you wanted Scott to go where next? Say it again. Just one thing.
Okay, next would be child immunizations, child vaccines.
Okay, so the vaccines, let me talk about vaccines in general, as well as in children a little bit. The vaccines, it turns out from the data that we see that vaccines are not as good at stopping infection or at stopping transmission as the initial data showed. But, and this is very important, although it's not reported for some reason, the vaccines are very protective at stopping people from dying. That's what the data still shows. I looked at the data from Israel, which is the country that sort of stirred up the pot with the vaccines. And when you look at it, and some of it says, okay, preventing infections only 39% to 50%, depending upon when you got vaccinated. But when you look at the most important thing to realize about vaccines is they do sort of one of two things. They're designed to do one of two things: stop an infection or stop a serious consequence of the infection. And the data on the Israeli population study that was published at the end of July, I think, was that even the people that were vaccinated back in January, the longest time ago, they still had 90+% protection against dying. So yes, you can get infected. Yes, you might be able to transmit the infection more frequently than the original data showed. But the data so far shows excellent protection against death. And that's the key part about being vaccinated. And that's why I recommend vaccination for people who have a risk of dying. Now, what about who should be vaccinated? Okay, I'm nobody's doctor. I'm not giving medical advice to anybody. That's a personal decision between a person and their doctor. But I would say that the data shows, I think it's reasonable, in my opinion, that people over 60 should probably get vaccinated. You could also make a case people over 50 should get vaccinated, and because the risk of the disease is higher than the risk of the vaccine, from what we know about the risk of the vaccine. We have incomplete knowledge on the risk of the vaccine, by the way. Now, young children getting vaccinated, okay, we have a disease where young children have almost no risk of dying, very, very low risk of a serious illness, rarely transmit to adults. I don't know about the case to be made for having children get vaccinated.
I noticed you emphasize personal decision in consultation with your doctor. I wondered if you'd expand on that for a minute.
Well, okay, so when I was on the podium, I said there will not be a vaccine mandate. That wasn't, applicable to today. But, in a free country, this is my own personal opinion. I don't know, for a virus that has, the risk that it does, the way it spreads, the fact that we have natural immunity in probably 100 million Americans, probably more. And there's a recent study that came out actually from Columbia University in the last 48 hours about this, I think, that over 100 million Americans likely have had the infection. You have natural immunity after the infection, period. That's not arguable. So mandating a vaccine, I think that's a stretch against what I would consider freedom of choice. This is, again, we have a risk. We're becoming a society, frankly, where we cannot tolerate any risk from this virus alone. We cannot tolerate any risk, and that equation only applies, it seems, to this single virus. The risk of a young child dying from COVID is higher than being hit by lightning. If we want to stop all car deaths, we would stop all highway driving, because you don't die in a car when you're driving 15 miles an hour. And so we could eliminate all car deaths for all motor vehicle accidents. So there's been a loss of perspective, and to mandate a vaccine, and nowadays we have the complexity of, well, the vaccine is being mandated or is being required, let's say, to do certain things, yet you're also told that it doesn't stop the infection or the spread very well, and you're also told to wear a mask, and you're also told to do all these other things. It's simply not logic to mandate a mask, in my view, to mandate a vaccine. It's not logic, but it's also, it does not serve the purpose that you would want it to do if you were going to mandate it, and it's a serious infringement on people's rights, given that they're not testing even for people who've had natural immunity. Natural immunity, as I mentioned, is better than the vaccine immunity. So why would you take the vaccine if you have natural immunity? But that's not even in the equation. It's not even mentioned. You're still
Yeah.
mandated, like everybody else, to get the vaccine by
Crazy,
employers or
crazy.
whatever.
Yes, Scott, we've got a number of people with us, of course, on this call. One of our friends participating via ThinkSpot has tossed in a question exactly on this point, or a comment. This person writes just a moment ago, many government officials, including in my home state of Washington, are now mandating the vaccination for employment. Is there a way for citizens who do not want the vaccine to protect their civil rights? You're trying to address that now, I think.
Yes. Well, I think, there are some fundamental questions about the society we live in that have been raised by the pandemic. One is the incredible power of the government to shut down everything indefinitely. I think that shocked everyone. But the second part is the acquiescence of the American people to things that are contrary to science, that are infringing on liberties, that are illogical, and that are not backed up by the data. It's simply done by edict. And I think that, the question is, what can people do? I mean, I think that, I don't know I think it's very difficult. I think we are sitting here in a society where the people in charge are issuing edict after edict. They're not even required to justify the edict. They don't discuss the data, and part of the reason that there's no demand for it is because of the censorship of the information from people like me and others. So we're in a quandary here. What I do see is, I look at the school board tapes on the news with the parents who were finally pushed too far about the curricula. They finally spoke up. I look at places like London and all over France and Australia and all kinds of countries of people demanding ends to lockdowns or demanding ends to vaccine requirements. I don't see that happening in the United States.
Are Americans more compliant than foreigners?
I don't think that there is a case to be made these days that Americans are the source of individual freedom. I really don't. And that's surprising to me. That's shocking. We live in a democracy. It's not just the opportunity to voice yourself. There's a requirement to make your voice heard in a democracy, or you're not going to have a democracy.
We're citizens.
You're citizens in a free society, and so you own the society. And so I don't understand why people are not making their voices heard. I don't know why you're not contacting the people in charge. I don't see it. It's certainly not on the news. And we see it in other countries. So I wonder, people say, what can we do? The change is not going to come from above, in my view. You don't look to somebody else to make a change. You have to be an active citizen.
Do you think that Americans are feeling more traumatized than people in other advanced industrial countries, more hysterical, and why?
Well, so? I think the evidence is they are more hysterical, and one of the points of evidence is that we were the only country that closed schools in the fall term of 2020. 17% of students had in-person learning in the United States, whereas all of our peer nations opened the schools. We're talking about all of Western Europe. Okay, there was an exception. Florida opened their schools, and I think South Dakota had schools that were open. But generally speaking, in the United States was uniquely hysterical about schools opening, even though the data was already in. There was no new science since then, zero. It was all known. And there's a reason why we were more hysterical, if I may. And there's a fascinating paper put out in National Bureau of Economic Research by researchers, I think from Brown University, who looked at the media reporting on the pandemic. And when you look at the media reporting of America's major media versus the non-American English-speaking media, they quantified the reporting into negative or positive, and let's just make the assumption that they did that correctly. 53% of reports from outside the US were negative during the pandemic. 53%, about half. But in the United States major media, 91% were negative. When numbers of stories about cases going up versus cases going down outweighed that 5.5 to 1, and that increase persisted even when cases were going down in the United States. Do you understand? So there's an incredible impact, in my view. I think it's undeniable, of the media reporting. It was extremely negative. It was extremely sensationalizing. I have, multiple examples of this. There's been a censorship in the United States of opinions and data interpretations contrary to the accepted narrative, and this has harmed the public, I think.
I wonder if you could go into the Stanford faculty's treatment of you, possibly into how Trump hatred might have figured into this. And I truly want you to say a bit more about what's in your book, because it sounds like it's going to be, I've pre-ordered it already myself. It sounds like it's going to be a fascinating read.
Yeah, I would say this, that, the universities in general have been extraordinarily harmful to the American people. Now, in the United States, the beacons of free thought, the beacons of the free exchange of ideas were supposed to be the universities. And instead, what we see and saw were complete attempts to intimidate, bully, and censure those who spoke against the conventional wisdom. And you would think that the universities wouldn't have an opinion that was so-called conventional at all. That's not their job, but they did. And the Stanford faculty, issued reprimands of me. And the interesting part is it was exactly the same information being transmitted from me as two of the best medical scientists in infectious disease at Stanford, John Ioannidis and Jay Bhattacharya, said exactly what I said, almost verbatim. And it's sort of interesting because I was working with them from day one. And so it's fascinating that the Stanford University faculty had their hair on fire about me. And obviously there was only one difference among the three of us. I stood next to Trump on the podium. And, this is a disgrace. It's a disgrace to what universities are supposed to be. It's a stain on the university itself. And I just want to say the freedom of speech is not just maintaining or keeping your job. Freedom of speech is speaking without the fear of intimidation, rebuke, and censure. And that intimidation is extraordinarily effective. Not on me, because I'm not the kind of person that's going to be intimidated. And the beauty of it is I was right about every single thing I said, and those people were completely wrong. But it was impactful on many people, including at Stanford. I got more than 100 emails from medical scientists and professors all over the country and indeed the world during the time during the pandemic, thanking me for saying what I said, encouraging me to keep saying it, but literally telling me in their emails they were afraid to step forward for themselves and their families, including medical scientists at Stanford itself. So this is very, very important for people to understand, because the COVID stuff will end, I think, and we are left with a society that has lost major avenues for solving problems because of censure and bullying, not just in the universities, but also in the medical and science journals. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done on the freedom in science and the freedom in academia, because that is what we believe are experts. And now the word expert has been damaged, possibly irreparably. I'm not sure about that. What I do in my book to get to that is, basically, the book has sort of three goals. One is to say what happened, because the truth matters, and we cannot have that happen again. And so I give a very detailed account of what I saw. And anyone who knows me knows that I say the truth. I'm not afraid to say the truth, period. That's one part of the book. The second part of the book is to clarify the data on the pandemic And it's not a scientific treatise on the pandemic because I was not encouraged to write a 2,000-page manuscript. But I tried to do it in a way that was readable, and I think I did that. And third is to discuss these big issues that were revealed in the pandemic, because these are the issues that now we as a society and as a world are left with. And the idea, by the way, that these policies were inflicted with the focus of stopping COVID-19 at all costs, without regard for the health of the people in the public, was not just a heinous abuse of the public, it was a massively destructive process on low income and poor families. And this, again, is never discussed because we have a class of people in charge who, I hate to use a trite phrase, but they are the elites. And okay, I'm in that socioeconomic class myself, but I didn't come from that. And maybe that's why I care. And when you understand that all of these harms to children, to families, in the United States at the lower end of the income scale were far more harmful. And then you look at the world where the lockdowns were done not just because of their own public health leaders, but because of the advice of the public health leaders and the way that in the United States and the sort of interconnectivity of the United States and the Western democracies with the third world, if you want to use a phrase like that. You have 130 million more people in the world into abject poverty because of the lockdowns. We have 400,000 new deaths this year alone from tuberculosis because of diversion of resources because of the lockdowns and the focus on COVID-19. We have tens of millions of babies extra dying of malaria because of the interruption of the chain of resources needed to combat that. We have 30 million people in India alone that went from middle class to lower income poverty in India alone. And these are people, when you take a poor country and you decrease the GDP, which is done by the lockdowns, you're impacting significantly life expectancy. These people are not living with a buffer. There's no cushion there. You take a country like Bangladesh, if I can be a little bit more specific, something like 4.1 million families have an income that's derived solely from one worker in the garment industry. When that whole chain of consumerism was interrupted with the lockdowns, the entire industry closed down in Bangladesh. That's the number one part of their GDP. The whole country's GDP went through the floor. So all these people are dying because of the lockdowns, and directly and indirectly, the lockdowns of the United States.
I'm letting that sink in as I hear that, Scott. It's kind of stunning.
This has been very fascinating.
Yeah, we were told that those lockdowns were for saving people's lives, but then they imperiled countless other people, and then they didn't even save the lives that they were supposed to save in the first place. Is that a simple way of putting it?
It's a simple way of putting it, and there's something even more staggering. We have the internal control here. Okay, Florida's governor did not shut down and, in fact, opened up completely at the end of August, beginning of September 2020. And when you look at the first year of the pandemic and you compare states, because we have the same country, so that kind of eliminates the differences in categorizing COVID deaths that you would get from international comparisons. When you look at Florida, it beat 2/3 of the states in excess mortality, which is the number of deaths above and beyond what you would have had without the pandemic. It beat the overall deaths per capita by 40%. And by the way, I just want to say this before I begin this paragraph that I'm going to say. It's not the job to prove that you did better in Florida. They didn't do the lockdown. The other states have to prove they saved lives by doing the lockdown because Florida avoided the damages of the lockdowns. If Florida did even remotely close to as well as a state which did the lockdown, then you shouldn't have done the lockdown. And so let's look at Florida versus California, two big states, two urban, rural, mixed states, two heterogeneous, diverse population states with relatively similar climates. And when we do a comparison like that, we see something. Florida, by the way, is the fifth oldest state. California is the seventh youngest state. So right away, Florida has a disadvantage because this disease kills the old people.
Right.
But even regardless of that, Florida outperformed California on every single metric that is meaningful in the lockdown. Florida beat California significantly in age-adjusted COVID mortality for all population. Florida beat California in age-adjusted COVID mortality for people over 65. Florida beat California in excess mortality. Florida did better than California. California is one of the most stringent lockdown states in the country, and Florida is the least stringent. Florida didn't just do equal to California with its lockdowns. Florida did far better. And that's fact. And I would love to hear the argument against that is based on fact, because there's no data that is meaningful to support the other side.
Here's a related point coming from one of our participants right now, who says Sweden is showing 0 daily deaths since mid-July. What general conclusions does this suggest? Sweden and
Yes.
Florida, similar?
Well, Sweden isn't much in, I don't think Sweden has much in common with Florida besides the reputation of not doing the lockdown.
Right, that's what I mean.
But I've looked at the data, and I think Sweden is a very interesting story. Sweden did the 9th best of 32 European countries in excess mortality. 9th best. Remember, you don't have to do better to be better to say that the lockdown shouldn't have been done, because Sweden did not do the lockdown. Sweden kept its schools open. Sweden had schools.
It had some problems with targeted protection of old people, as I recall.
Yeah, Sweden did not do the masks and the distancing in schools. Sweden did poorly in Stockholm, particularly. At one point, 70% of the deaths were in nursing homes.
Yeah.
Okay, so they did poorly with that. There's no question. But when you look at Sweden, Sweden's excess mortality is 1.5%. Age-adjusted excess mortality. And if I look, I'm trying to think through the chart that I was just looking at the other day of all the European countries. I mean, that's one of the best. And so then people say, well, but Sweden didn't do as well as Finland, for instance, and shouldn't it have done the same? Well, first of all, Sweden is not Finland, okay? Yes, they know how to cross-country ski. Yes, they eat herring. Yes, they make all these, they're in Scandinavia. But the reality is that the Northland of Sweden is very similar to Finland in terms of its geography, its socioeconomic status, its composition. And that part of Sweden did the same as Finland. But if you take Sweden has very different immigration, very different population heterogeneity. For instance, Finland, all the immigrants that came in the previous 5 years to Finland were from Scandinavia. All the population inflow into Sweden for the previous 5 years came from North Africa and Middle East and a lot of other. It's a very different country. But the interesting part of it all that people, and I have a slide, I unfortunately don't have it available right now to show, is that what's ironic about the whole thing is people laud Finland over Sweden. After the first closure of businesses in Finland in March, they opened up more than Sweden for the rest of the pandemic starting June 1, 2020. They were more open than Sweden, according to the COVID stringency lockdown data of ourworldindata.org. You can look it up. So Finland, to say that Finland did really well, is also endorsing anti-lockdown policy.
Interesting.
That's what's the irony of the whole thing.
You know what's really striking to me as I listen to you, Scott, is why is it that I am so rarely hearing these facts as I try and stream through the media and educate myself on these matters? Why are so few people with expert knowledge like yourself talking about this? And you've already alluded to it a bit. I fear the answer may be because there are other people cowering in fear lest they be somehow harmed if they say plainly what you're saying. Is that right? How can that be?
Okay, there's two parts to it. One is people are afraid, but I think that the more people have spoken out, the less people are afraid. But there's become a more aggressive censoring process. You would think that as we got vaccinations and things, there'd be less censorship, but it became more aggressive. I'll give you an example of how aggressive it became. Excuse me. I did an expert panel at the request of Governor DeSantis back in the winter of 2021. And there were 4 of us on the panel, and it was in front of the press live. Governor DeSantis invited me, Martin Kulldorff, a Harvard epidemiologist, Jay Bhattacharya, a Stanford medical scientist, and Sunetra Gupta from Oxford. We were all there. We answered questions. The press conference was posted on YouTube, and YouTube pulled down the press conference. They pulled it down, the panel discussion, and you didn't even know it was pulled down. That shows the effect of the censorship. But it was pulled down. This is the governor of Florida in the biggest healthcare crisis of the century. And what I mean by that is the virus and its management. That's the crisis, the virus and its management. That kind of stuff was censored. There were many other episodes of censoring going on, not just of me, of course, by many people. YouTube, Twitter pulling down, Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford epidemiology discussions. All kinds of things have been done, and this has been very effective. And so the information, this is something that what you said is something I encounter all the time. Why have I never heard this? Is the question to me.
Yes, that's right.
Why have I never heard this? And that is very, very frightening. That this is not new data, by the way. Okay, this is data that is known. It's in my book, by the way. And I think, I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, frankly, is because, okay, this book will be out there. Unless they're going to go on a massive book burning spree, like, Fahrenheit 451 or something, I don't think that's going to happen. So the public record has to be visible. And, I'm going to start doing more interviews. I was working very hard on the book, and I'm finished. And so the information is there, but it's being censored. And this is the biggest change that I see in my lifetime in the United States. Maybe it always happened, but I was never aware. And this is something we must fight against. The freedom of information is critical here. And I don't understand the rationale even for having people censored or erased or canceled. And the university intimidation is all part of the cancel culture intended to intimidate and undermine people who are saying something that is contrary to what those people want to be said.
We have had you talking pretty seriously and strenuously for over an hour now. We should probably give you a break, but can I toss in just a couple little questions we're getting from our participants? And then, of course, I'll give Bill a chance again in a moment. One person says, wish that you could give a reference to where they can get the Agarwal study that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's the last I saw was NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. Agrawal, I think is the way to spell it. He's from USC, University of Southern California. He's on the paper. There's several co-authors. NBER, June 2021.
And the reason the person is interested in Agarwal study is because his point was, again, remind us why he was interesting. He said what Agarwal said in his study.
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah. Just a quick reminder so we know what this is about again.
He said he proved that the lockdowns did not stop the deaths. In fact, anywhere except for 2 places in this data, which were islands. Okay, Hawaii, I think his islands were Hawaii and Australia back then. But of the 50-some places looked at, I forget the number. The lockdowns did not stop the deaths. In fact, the lockdown timing correlated to increasing the dying.
Good grief.
And you may want to say, why is that? And that's because one reason is because, as we all know by now, but no one acknowledges, the cases are not really spread outside. They're only spread inside to a great extent. I mean, the overwhelming majority of cases, not all, but the overwhelming majority. And when you lock people inside, confining them to their homes, there's more personal interaction. and you generate cases. And you cannot protect the vulnerable if everybody is outside mingling with the inside mingling with the vulnerable. That's one of the dangers, by the way, that I had pointed out back in the summer last year, was if you lock down and you delay cases in the places that are in the United States, like the north central part, like I'm born in Chicago, in the winter, when the winter comes, you're not going to be able to isolate anybody because you can't go outside. It's too cold, and the cases spread indoors, and that's what the lockdowns actually sort of emphasized.
Okay, thank you very much. That's worth looking up. Here's another quick question. CDC seems to have downplayed the use of therapeutic treatments like HCQ and others. Can you comment? Was that one?
Yes, I can comment. I mean, I think this is another one of the sort of tragic mismanagements. The question why is sort of a more complicated question, that why did that happen? But the tragic error, after a year and a half of this pandemic, we have not done large scale controlled clinical trials on multiple potential remedies that are good for outpatient treatment or even prevention. And you know, why do I say that there are potential remedies? Well, two reasons. Number one, there are several drugs whose what's called mechanism of action, meaning in a lab, they do stuff that would seem to indicate they will stop the infection. They will either stop the virus from invading the cell or stop part of the reaction to that virus being present. That's known in the lab, that happens. And the second part of the evidence is that there have been several clinical studies that were observational. They weren't perfectly controlled studies, but some of them are pretty good studies that show that the drugs have potential to work. And so I think it's very important that people question, why is it that we have a country or a world, but a country that seems to think that the only remedy is a vaccine? That's what happened, if people want to really remember, with HIV and AIDS. And I really wasn't involved then, but I looked it up, and I have the history a little bit mentioned in my book, which is that there were people who were focused completely on a vaccine for AIDS, and there was a delay in the development of drugs and the use of drug
Turned
trials.
out that the treatment was the important thing.
And it
because
turned out that that's
they
what
still
we
don't have a
rely on.
vaccine for it, right?
We use drugs for HIV/AIDS. It's been life-saving, and there is no vaccine for that. And you have to wonder. It's sort of interesting, and I think you should read the book about that, because I mentioned who is at the helm then.
Aha. Another little.
Not Fauci by any chance.
Yeah.
Anyway,
look at that.
I want to mention another thing. So throughout this whole conversation, you've shown that you're very data oriented, very empirically oriented, very careful in what you say. And yet early in your public career in this Corona episode, the news media and politicians and people went after you over what they tried to portray what you were saying about herd immunity. So I think as we close out here, it would be helpful for you to clarify to our listeners and viewers what herd immunity is, what you said about it, what they said you said.
Sure. Herd immunity is biology. It's a biological phenomenon where enough people have immunity of some form to an infection so that the spread of that infection is blocked, the propagation of that infection is blocked, and therefore vulnerable people are prevented from getting exposed or getting the infection. This is a biological phenomenon. I mean, this is decades and decades old. I never advocated, what people said was somehow I was advocating a, quote, herd immunity strategy. First of all, that's an frankly asinine statement, because the only way that every virus is stopped is when enough people have immunity to it. That's why you give the vaccines. Vaccination is a herd immunity strategy. But what they really meant, to imply, which was a lie, was that I was advising that we should just let the infection spread and run rampant and survival of the fittest, and that's what we
Right.
should do. And that's not, I never said that. I don't know anyone who even said that. The same claims were made about the people who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. They never said that. What I said was increase the protection of the people at high risk and stop killing the people who are low risk with the lockdowns. And I don't think there's anything in there. I never once advised letting the infection spread. I never once advised the president to let the infection spread. But that was a gross distortion. That's Washington, D.C., as I found out. It's a despicable place, as probably many people listening understand, which is unfortunate because it discourages good people with a reputation to lose from serving the country.
Right.
I was asked by the President of the United States to help in the biggest healthcare crisis in the century. I'm a health policy person, and I think there would have been something despicable about me if I would have said no. I had nothing to do with politics there. That wasn't the reason I entered that world. I never understood how vile that was or that would be. But, if people that are good don't step up and answer when the President of the United States asks for their help, the country's finished. And so I did. And everything I said, of course, was correct. That's proven. And I have no regret really about doing it. But it's sad. It's a sad statement on the country. The press is completely unreliable. We have a propaganda level of our media, as everybody probably listening knows. And so it's a very sad statement on the media, who are frankly the purveyors of the information. Without the media, most people cannot get information. So it's a very dangerous situation. But if anybody's listening who's young, who asks, because I've been asked many times, would you do it again? And I've said in the past, it's hard to say yes to that. It is hard to say yes, but the answer must be yes. You have no choice. If you are asked to help and you have something to contribute, you really you must go. You must say yes. And I feel that cannot be lost on people. And I do think that when people like me go and went, it hopefully gave some courage to other people to step forward. Eventually the Great Barrington Declaration was written. Eventually other people are involved, and people are starting to question things, and that's the process. But regular people have to have courage, or at least be critical thinkers. You have to be thinking critically what the government or what the school or what the university is requiring you or your child to do. You have to think now. The burden is on us as individuals to think critically. We cannot rely on self-identified experts anymore. That era is over.
Dr. Scott Atlas, thank you for saying yes to that call of duty. Thank you for continuing to speak in public and to give us what we are rarely otherwise hearing. And let me just remind everybody with us that they should be watching for your book, A Plague Upon Our House, My Fight at the Trump White House to Stop COVID from Destroying America. You can pre-order it now on Amazon, I think. And of course, it's going to be appearing in November in print. Also, keep in mind that anybody who wants to go deeper here can also turn to us here at the Independent Institute. Our website is a treasure trove of information. We have a COVID subsection, which includes some material from Dr. Scott Atlas. I invite you to go to independent.org with a thank you in passing and parting to Bill Evers for being with me today. Bill, thank you. And again, Scott Atlas, keep up the good work.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
On behalf of everybody here at the Independent Institute, have a great day. Bye-bye.